Welcome, everyone. We are so glad that you've joined us today. Tech stacks are becoming increasingly diverse, and as a result, there's a heightened demand to support engineering teams and meet developers where they are. We can no longer rely on DevOps practices, processes, or tooling all by themselves. In fact, there's an even greater power recognized that's improving workflows. It's not just tools and infrastructure, it's advocating for developers' needs. This approach, called developer experience, is what brings us here together today. Earlier this year, DZone surveyed our global audience to gain some insight into the current state of developer experience in the software development space. Taking all perspectives, technologies, and methodologies into account, we just released a brand new trend report called Developer Experience, the Coalescence of Developer Productivity, Process Satisfaction, and Platform Engineering. We have original research we do in-house with expert perspectives on what it means to effectively advocate for the developers and craft your teams and software systems accordingly, resulting in higher value, more impact, more sentiment, and the software we create, maintain, and deploy comes out great. With us today, we have a great panel of experts. I'm so excited to introduce you to them. Luca comes to us, a core contributor from Platform Engineering. Hey, Luca. Authored our welcome letter for our trend report. Justin, Deputy CTO of DX. Welcome. And Mads, Technical Product Marketing Manager at Retool. To get started, we want to talk about the first question. About half of our respondents, around 56%, said they agree or strongly agree that they have the tools, the processes, and productivity metrics needed to be successful. Right, huge for people in their job and for job experience and satisfaction. A lot of respondents said they agree, but in larger organizations seemed to feel like they have more resources. But that's definitely not the only factor, right? It's not just company size. So with about half of the respondents reporting that they had what they need to be successful, it validates this new reality, right? We have to pay close attention to and invest in the developer experience, right? 50%, half of our developers might not be enough, right? So I want to ask, and Justin, we'll start with you if we can, like what challenges or gaps in resources in meeting these needs have you personally encountered over, let's say, the last year that kind of supports this theory or even challenges it? Give me some examples if you can.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jesse. I mean, I think it's interesting that you see the trend, especially in like the larger mid-markets or enterprise companies, because these tend to be companies that have been acquisitive. They've had to pull in infrastructure and platforms from other companies and not necessarily integrate them as well as possible. And so I think that a lot of times what you end up with in these types of companies is just a disconnect between the ground truth of the work that's actually being done by developers and leadership that's responsible for kind of putting this new tooling in place. Also, having learned quite a bit about surveys since coming to DX, I've found that we don't always get, they tend to, sometimes you get these optimistic sort of answers that don't actually reflect what's really going on. So that 50%, maybe even higher. And I think that when we start looking at other metrics, we know that studies that were done just recently, there was an April 2022 study that was done by the authors of Space Framework and through University of Victoria, where they looked at, they asked individual contributors and they asked group contributors the same question: how do you define productivity within your organization? And then they normalized their answers into Space Framework. And I won't go too deep into Space Framework, but everybody should be looking into what that is. And what they found was that when they normalized the answers, developers were answering in terms of like activity metrics, like, yeah, I'm writing a lot of code, I'm doing a lot of pull requests, I'm doing a lot of commits. And managers were answering almost specifically in terms of like performance, like, oh yeah, well, we're meeting our deadlines or we're not meeting our deadlines. There was almost no talk about satisfaction, which is one of the most important metrics in Space Framework. So I think that the challenges that I've seen have been certainly, and as companies get larger and more acquisitive, a disconnect between the leadership and decision makers and the ground truth of the organization, but also even just the right parameters for the conversation around developer experience, the right definitions, and understanding like the real challenges and metrics that tell the full story.
Okay, interesting. Mads, is that jiving with what you see with developers and the experiences that they're getting, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Like almost point for point, something that I've seen, experienced, and spent some time writing and thinking about. And I think the crux of the disconnect between sort of what the business is pushing for and driving for, and really, putting a lot of pressure on everyone, blamelessly, but the organization puts pressure on folks to move faster and do more better. And that's really, really tough, right? And so I think that as people are hyper focusing on those metrics that say, like, I am doing tickets, I'm knocking through all this work, I think it's really important to take a breath and think about, like, what are you spending your time doing? What are you actually writing? What are you coding? And is it what you enjoy? That's like, it is a personal passion of mine. And it's something that, my organization is trying to talk more about, which is, there are so many tools and processes now to move faster, do more, to give us that 56% that said they have all their bases covered. But if you are, a data engineer and you are really, really hyper focused on perfecting, the one part of your analysis that you'd love to finish, and that's like your zone of excellence, your interest, are you actually getting to spend the majority of your time doing that, or are you doing some of the groundwork, the boilerplate, and the busy work? And I think, for me, that's a huge pillar of DevX that is not quite as often talked about as, like, what do you love doing, and how can we unlock that for you? So I'd love to see more conversation and attention paid to how can we, if you're a manager, how can we let our devs do what they want to do while making our business needs met? And as an individual dev, like, what can I do to optimize away from the stuff I just don't want to be doing right now?
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right, Luca, what about you? From your seat, what do you see?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that both Justin and Matt said. I think very, very interesting. This idea that, I think the larger the organization, you see really just this sprawling of tools, of tech, of scripts, of different things that they have to interact with developers, and that's really, at the end of the day, what really makes developer experience really, really bad, right? Is it's increasing, it's actually skyrocketing, cognitive load on developers, right? Developers are really just overwhelmed in the vast majority of cases, in terms of, like, hey, what used to be a couple of scripts, a couple of tools to deploy a change to my code and see, and test it into a dev or staging environment. Now it became, 10, 15 different things. And I need to understand Kubernetes, and I need to understand Terraform, and I need to understand all those different things that I might or might not be an expert in, and I might or might not enjoy, right? There are some developers that really enjoy getting their hands dirty in all the configuration stuff. There are developers that really don't want to know anything about that. And so I think, the current setup in a lot of, like you were saying, Justin, mid-sized, large-sized enterprise especially, is, a total block, really, from developer perspective, where they're just, hey, I don't know exactly what I'm doing here. I don't want to touch it. I'm just going to wait on my ops colleagues to help out. And that's really, I think, going back to your intro, Jesse, where DevOps breaks, in today's setups is, you can't, this idea of shifting left and developers do everything, you build it, you run it. It's like, it sounds good in theory. In practice, when you have, like, hundreds of developers working on hundreds of applications that have all, like, interdependencies, it just doesn't work, right? It just doesn't scale. And I think the other interesting thing that I think we can maybe, like, expand later on when we start talking about platform engineering is another thing that you mentioned, Justin, which is, how different people frame their problems in different ways, right? And I think that's ultimately the interesting thing, because, whether you look at platform engineering or DevOps or literally any org transformation before that, and, since the beginning of time, like, it's really about, like, it's really like a cultural challenge more than a technical challenge. Yes. And so, like, how do you get everybody on board? And so how do you speak their languages, and how do you, play back their problems, really, which is the hardest part, I think.
Yeah, you're right. This question, I was wondering how long we'd get into this without saying shift left. I think it was about a minute and a half, but it's true, right? As you talk to security people, well, it would be more secure if you shifted it left. DevOps goes faster for the business if you shift it left. Well, the problem is you go so far left, there's only developers. There's no further left you can go. And so that's where the buck stops, so to speak. And that you're right. And that's where, when you look into some of these things, I love the way we talk about it with the human element. or the human experience. They're humans on the other end, not cogs in a wheel, and they can feel that way sometimes. And especially because we talk about it. And listen, as a developer from the 90s, I know last century, it's hard because we talk about it in terms, and we will hear metrics too, in terms of workflow, process automation, right? These are all words that we use in factories. And so it can feel very inhumane. And that's going to bring us to our next question, which is, we talked about workflow and process automation and how it's got room to grow, especially in smaller organizations, right? Luca, to your point, the bigger organizations have just tons of tools and process and people, but the smaller organizations are less likely to have the resources to do some of that. But we have AI, right? So advancements of AI technologies have increased the availability of these tools. And my son is a developer and he uses it every day. Right. I know no developers that don't use AI every day. So it's pretty commonplace at this point. And the use of AI things for like code generation or helping debugging and code reviews, they're growing in popularity. So I want you to think about, from your seats as experts on our panel, what advice would you give to some of these smaller organizations, developers at these smaller organizations who are listening to us right now, looking to better incorporate workflow and process automation, right? And does that advice, go against or work with resources with AI? And Mads, let's start with you.
Sure, happy to. I think the AI piece of this can feel like it is, of course, a huge fundamental change. But I think my general approach and philosophy to any kind of like, how do I boil this ocean is start small. And so I specifically tie that to the sort of the proliferation of AI capabilities now, because it can feel like not only can you boil the ocean, you must, right? There's this intrinsic drive forward and extrinsic. Yeah. So my specific advice, especially for smaller orgs who are resource strapped, who need to start somewhere, literally is take that first bite of the elephant. Find the workflows, find the processes that are giving you the most grief, and that, they are at the intersection of giving you the most grief and would have the most impact to fix. And so that requires thinking about it perhaps more than actually doing the technical work to get those workflows set up. And that's tough to ask for sometimes. Like that might even be impossible to ask for depending on what deadlines you need to hit. But if you set your sights small, fix the one thing and fix it really, really well, that's my first piece of advice. And, treat that if you do identify that one process and even in that workflow, and you can't get that all done in the time that you have allotted, take a modular approach, fix one thing at a time, and sort of, don't feel like you have to fix your entire organization. And the second one too, the sort of like the big AI piece is there are a ton of capabilities out there. There are a ton of tools you can bring in, a ton of tools you may even have in your stack already. Don't be afraid of those, but remember that you're in the driver's seat. That's that's like one of my, there's a personal passion to this, and there's more like the organizational DevX TM, but it is like, use it to be the smartest version of yourself, the most effective version of whatever that superlative you want to be. Use those tools as tools, not the final answer. And if you can start with those two things, I think you can make a ton of progress toward automating the processes that you need to.
Awesome. The force multiplier. I love it. Yeah, the tools. Saddle up. All right, Justin, what do you think?
Yeah, this is actually kind of timely. I'm working on a research report right now that will hopefully get out within the next few weeks. That's effectively a guide for executives or managers, directors to effectively optimize the ROI of an investment in a coding assistant like a Copilot or a Cursor, or something like that. Okay. And the way that I think we do this is by evenly distributing how engineers within the organization are enabled to use the technology, right? So again, we have this disconnect sometimes in these larger enterprises between the ground truth and the actual leadership. And what that also means is that you have leadership sometimes who's bringing AI into the business because they think they should, right? Some CIO brought it up, or they saw something somewhere, or they fear of missing out or whatever. But then they don't actually know what to tell the developers to use it for, right? And to your point, this younger generation of developers, they seem to just sort of embrace it, right? It's like, okay, this is my co-pilot, right? This is my assistant. I'm gonna build these amazing workflows where I have conversational relationships with the bot first to blow holes in my idea, then turn around and pass that full conversation transcript into a reasoning model to build a spec, and then I'm gonna turn around and put that spec into a code gen model, and then have my code struts out in an hour. I've done what used to take like, a week to get planned. I mean, it really is amazing. But I think
it is.
Talking to a lot of developers, I was just at DevNexus and I explained this workflow idea, like workflow over lazy prompting. And they were like, wow, that's a really good idea. I'm like, these are veteran developers, like have been around for a long time. And I think that, I make the metaphor. So I grew up playing video games like a lot of us, child of the 80s and programmer in the 90s. And, I talked to my son-in-law about these like massive, crazy games that they have now, and I'm not good at them, right? And I used to be pretty good at games. And he brought up one time, he was like, "Well, do you use a guide?" I'm like, "Well, no, that's cheating. You can't use a guide, right? Like that's not what you do." But what's happened now is actually these big games have all been designed knowing that everyone has YouTube and knowing that everyone's going to be looking at a guide. And so it's not cheating anymore. But I think a lot of us who are veteran developers, they look at it as like the psychology is like, well, that's just cheating. I didn't do it myself.
Yeah, I love that idea. Yeah.
Proud of like spending the weekend cranking out 100,000 lines of code. And like, that's not the thing to do anymore. We have to let go of our ego a little bit there and realize, well, what you were really bragging about was rote memorization of certain code patterns. Right. And I mean, that's cool. Like good for you. You spent the time, but you don't need to do that anymore. Right. I think the other thing to bear in mind too, is that it's not just all about code gen. So part of this research report, I interviewed a bunch of kind of power users of AI, and I asked them to kind of stack rank their perception of, what are the top 5 use cases for a code assistant that are saving you the most time. And the first couple of them were not code generation use cases. They're like stack trace analysis was the number one. That was the biggest time saver, was stack trace analysis, which is more interpretation, right? And then you certainly have like unit test generation, which is a little spicy because, if you're a test-driven developer, you probably think the opposite of that. You should be using CodeGen to generate from your tests, and we can have that discussion later. But I think that if I really had to boil it down to a single or distill it down to a single piece of advice, it's just really make sure that you're educated on the best use case of this. If you're a manager or a leader, make sure that you're enabling your engineers to understand all the different ways that they can use it, and always, of course, deal with that psychological safety aspect too. Like here, so that you can concentrate on higher order thinking and move the entire organization faster. I know this cliche has been said many, many times, but AI is not going to take your job, but somebody really good with AI might. And so make all your people really good with AI.
Yeah, that's great. I tell people table saws don't build cabinets. Yeah. They just make the woodsmen and the craftsmen and the cabinet makers go a lot faster. And so, and to your point, that the first time, this was a year ago, so kind of earlier, my son had the ChatGPT analyze code from 3 different perspectives to pretend to be 3 different developers and argue with itself. I was floored. And that when you want to feel like an old man, an old fogey developer, right? That was my moment. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm like those old COBOL guys that I used to make fun of in 98, but they embrace it so much better. I love that. The psychology, it made me think. And I don't play Monster Hunter either, but I do play Zelda. So there you go. All right, Luca, from your perspective, real quick, would love to get that because I think advice from all the different seeds is valuable. So what advice would you give?
Yeah. So I really like what you just said, Justin, in terms of like, where do you start? Because I think the initial kind of instinct of a lot of organizations, executives, is actually to say, code gen, or like, how do we like immediately go in and like change things? And the problem is like when you, especially when you're talking about enterprise, you really can't do that. Like you can't have like a model that just goes and like starts changing your IEC files and so on, right? And everybody's afraid of hallucination. Although it's funny because, obviously, like everybody else, we're doing a lot of research in AI too, and like what it means for platform engineering. And, you speak to all these people in the enterprise and they'll tell you like, oh, we're not allowed to do all these things and we're not allowed to touch all these things, but we do it anyway. And they're actually just like generating like Terraform files with LLMs and so on. So like, so I think for me, like from an enterprise perspective, it's definitely looking at like, okay, you can actually use these things first and foremost as a discovery mechanism and visualization layer, and kind of understand, okay, what are the different relationships between things, and how can I, and what would happen if, right, before you actually do anything. And on the flip side, when you think about, smaller teams and startups, well, I think it's just way, way easier, right? Because it tends to be just like younger developers that just are used to AI stuff and they don't have the constraints, right? They don't need to worry about some like safety and governance team that is like on their back. At the same time, though, I think it's important to don't, like, when you're at the early stage of things, not to over process things. And try to, like, turn everything to like, okay, so this is how it's done, because then, you're back to square one in a sense, right? And I think a good way of doing that is sort of thinking like, even if you, let's say you're like a 20, 30, 50 developers engineering team, right? You probably don't really need like a formal platform yet, right? When we think about, AI workflows and developer experience and so on. But I think it's very helpful when you are modifying and improving your workflows that you think, what's the end design here? Which again is not going to be your end design, but at least like what's the V1 that we have in mind that we want to converge towards? Because there's this nice quote, it's like if you don't build your platform, it will build itself, right? And so it's very important that to an extent, we experiment, we do new things and so on, but that we sort of like consciously think about, okay, how will all these pieces fit together eventually? And you don't know, you don't have a clear answer, nobody does, but at least think about it, because otherwise you quickly end up on a local maximum that is not great.
What a great piece of advice. We used to call that accidental architecture, where if you're not purposeful with it, it'll design itself and you'll end up with a monster. I love it. I want to move us into the next part of the talk, because talk a little bit about metrics, performance metrics, and how to measure that. And we give a list, right? We CPU usage, response time, DORA metrics, user satisfaction, all that kind of stuff on how to measure performance, right? And 95% of the respondents said they use at least one of the 20 metrics we had. And about half, 52%, said they use 4 or more, except for user satisfaction, right? No performance metric response rate significantly increased when we compared it to another trend research report we did on observability and performance. So we did a survey there, but some of them decreased. But whichever performance metrics are used, I know is going to change from organization to organization, different applications and developers. And there's a lot more tracked than what we listed in the 20, right? Or what most people know about, right? Reporting is not 100% transparent. And with the organizational goals and things shifting, getting information about performance metrics from a single person is probably going to give us some incomplete results in our survey, right? But when it comes to measuring the success and performance of applications and engineering teams, right? Do you believe from your seat that variability is a good thing instead of standardization, right? Or would you look for more standardization, right? More uniform metrics across the board? Right. Or at the very least across teams, maybe, and I'm talking about that, globally between companies and between teams. Like, is there value in trying to standardize how we measure some of this stuff? Right. And Luca, let's start with you and see what you think. Like, as we're talking about measuring teams, do you think there should be some standards, or you just think variability is good?
I think it's a great question, and I think the answer is it depends. And I think it depends on time, right? So okay. I think it's great to have standards, and Justin is definitely the expert here on all the standards. But I think what I've seen, at least in platform engineering initiatives, let's improve developer experience initiatives, is this trying to gravitate towards the standardized frameworks a little bit too early, too fast, where we're, a lot of times I think like very even anecdotal qualitative metrics are a much better guidance than your DORA metrics, right? So for example, when we think about, hey, what do we want to achieve here in the first like 1 month of our platform engineering initiative or whatever initiative, right, to improve internal workflows. You could start saying, well, our current deployment frequency is X, and we want X plus Y. You could do that. First of all, in my experience, most teams say they measure these things. In reality, they don't really. So you don't really have a baseline oftentimes that that is reliable across different teams, across different workflows. But anyway, I think it will be really hard for whatever improvement you actually create to immediately show on those things, right? And again, I'm not sure that's even the right kind of like North Star that you want to optimize against at the beginning. I think you're much better off, for example, just asking your developer, hey Jimmy, like how much time do you need right now to get a database provision? And it's like, it takes me 2 weeks. I need to wait for 2 weeks on Amy, who's on the other side. And then you go to Amy, it's like Amy spends like 40% of her time like fielding ticket ops and trying to provision databases for Jimmy and his colleagues, right? And so I think you're much better off like setting that baseline and then going back through 4 weeks later and like, look, like Jimmy now can self-serve stuff in a matter of minutes, and and Amy spends like just 10% of her time on the backlog as opposed to like 40% of her time. And this is, in my experience, how top performing platform teams at least are able to move quick, right? Because then they're able to kind of like what we kind of mentioned at the beginning, like take what the current pains are and play them back to the different stakeholders with some clear improvements and some clear, like, hey, here's what's in it for you, right? Because I feel like so often, otherwise, this like top-down initiatives, especially around let's improve developer experience, let's improve this or that, can feel very abstract, and it's not very clear for the individual contributors or the individual teams what's in it for me. Like, why should I support this thing, right? And so it's this like constant feedback loop of going, figuring out where the pain is and then selling it back to the different stakeholders. That is really what makes a difference.
Okay, cool. All right, Justin, what do you think? I know he was referencing you and calling you out, so I figured I'd go there next.
I have some opinions on this now. I think Luke is spot on. In fact, it's been amazing to find when we start gathering qualitative metrics and we ask the questions the right way. So self-reported metrics, they're usually within a margin of error to what we pull from system metrics. Like, going to give you a great example is like PR throughput, right? So if we look at like, how many pull requests are kind of coming through the system, that's a good metric as to like work being done. Of course, it's easy to game that metric if you're only looking at one metric. But when we simply ask developers, how often do you get to work on small incremental changes? Always, sometimes, never, that response rate that we get from developers ends up pretty much aligning to what we see in GitHub, especially when we do a larger sample of the self-reported metrics. I don't want to trivialize DORA metrics. I do think that they are important. I think they tell us things about the health of our engineering system. I think they tell us things about the way that we can deliver software. If you look at deployment frequency, for instance, as a single metric, a business that can, not that they need to, but can deploy code 100 times a day is culturally, fundamentally a much different business than one that can only do it once a month, right? And the knock-on effect is what happens if there's a major security vulnerability that gets announced, right? Well, now I have a company that's scrambling to get their stuff patched, and it could take a month to actually get that stuff out, even with an all-hands-on-deck type of situation, versus a company that's got a great deployment frequency, and they're like, oh, no bother, we're fixed in like a minute. I think in terms of standardizing, we should standardize on practices, and we should standardize on the metrics that we're looking at. We should not standardize on thresholds, right? We should not hold certain teams to account, because teams are going to have their own individual culture, and they're going to have their own set of deliverables. And so diffs per engineer may look totally different from a team that's working on a highly volatile API with the ever-changing backend data versus something that might be a little bit more static. I think in terms of what some of these practices should look like, number one, find an audience, right? So one of the biggest problems that happened with Dora when Dora started getting really popular was everybody started tracking it, and they put Dora metrics up on a dashboard and nothing happened because there was no one actually looking at the data, no one who was accountable for owning the data. And more importantly, there was no precedent for integrating that data into day-to-day decision making, right? The data is useless unless you're actually using it to make decisions. So I think that that's a big one, is finding an audience. The next important thing, and if you look at the DX platform, we have this baked in to the actual utilization of the platform. Do not look at individual metrics. Do not look at individual output metrics, right? Don't measure individual developers on their perceived productivity through any of these metrics, because that leads immediately to what we refer to as Goodhart's law, which is the law that anytime a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. There are so many ways that if you give me PR throughput as how it's going to determine my bonus, or whether I get fired if I'm incentivizing or if I'm punishing based on these metrics, you better believe if I need 20 PRs a week, I will get it by updating the README file 20 times in the first day. And now my PR throughput looks outstanding, right? So when we look at team output metrics, things become a lot more truthful. Let's say that I've got an individual on the team who's a more, let's say, veteran developer, like someone my age, who's helping a lot more with mentorship and code review and helping other people understand how to write readable code and that sort of stuff. My PR metrics are probably not going to look great. Like my PR throughput is probably not going to look great because I'm spending most of my time helping other people get their pull requests in. But if you take me off the team or if you fire me, you better believe that overall team output is going to tank, right? And so that's why I think it's a lot more. So I would say standardize on practices, the way that you find audiences for metrics, the way that you integrate those metrics with day-to-day decision making, but don't standardize on thresholds and don't measure at the individual level.
Awesome. Great. I love that so much. Mads, get in there. What do you think?
All right. Yeah. I mean, Luca and Justin, you guys answered comprehensively a lot of things I would have loved to say as well. So it's nice that, very diverse experiences in the field and what we're coming to talk about, we all tend to kind of come to some some similar truths. I'd say just adding a couple other things that are top of my mind onto the answer. Standardization is great for setting those baselines, for kind of getting a holistic view of, okay, compared to other organizations, other teams, like there is a ton of value in creating those standardizations, whether they're for the metrics themselves or the practices. I tend to very much feel in my gut that like the practice standardization is a great way to go. Where I think a hybrid approach would be really, really helpful, right? So having a set of standards, having attachment to something like a Dora, whatever that is for your organization or your team, and introducing some variability, some flexibility in other metrics that you set as your own baselines per team, per person. That's like the best for me. That's like the Goldilocks approach, which is you have the best of all worlds. The only caveat and the only caution with introducing variability. So again, like my overall philosophical stance is standards, yes, with room for variation. That's the best way forward. But the only thing to take note, and where I kind of come in from more of the business oriented side here, whatever metrics your team or organization rallies around and decides are important, when there is variability in them, when there is some kind of customization or, the standards, or excuse me, the metrics that you set up for your team and your projects, they do have to be understandable by the people above you. Whether that is, perhaps the director of the team communicates them up to, the C-suite at that level, great. Maybe nothing else needs to be sorted out. But like whatever that layer is of where the next decision makers are, they just have to be communicated, presented, and translated in a way that's super understandable. And then the last, I'll stop there. I think that is the way to move forward with scaling your teams and making sure there's an iterative process on the metrics that you have.
Very cool, man. We could have talked about that all day. That one's a huge topic. I do want to move us through a little bit, so I'll skip down. But when we're talking about platform engineering, which we've mentioned a couple of different times, I know Luca, this one's going to go to you first, of course. But while we talked about the common metrics and things, internal developer platforms teams, they're not universal. right? It's like a fingerprint, right? Every organization, there are some things that are very similar, but there's a lot of stuff that's different. But I want to talk a little bit about infrastructure as code as a tool, right? So whenever you're talking about platform engineering, infrastructure as code usually comes up. It's a tool. Developers seem to find it highly valuable, having a lower barrier to entry resource-wise than something like IDPs. So they're pretty common. And most developers utilize infrastructure as code, sometimes even without, adopting full-on platform engineering. So there's room for increased adoption among small and mid-sized organizations in particular. So Luca, as these teams are weighing critical infrastructure decisions based on resources, bandwidth, all of those things, do we do IDPs? Do we do IACs? All of that. How can they make that decision better? Like, what should they be considering, right, from your seat, as they're trying to figure out how to get started with integrating platform engineering into their systems and teams?
Yeah, totally. I mean, so I think it's important to first point out, so IAC and IDP are not like mutually exclusive at all, right? Like IAC is just right. Used within the IDP context. What you see in the majority of cases, again, if you think about this, smaller teams going into enterprise size organizations, is, people will start using IAC because, it makes your life easier, it makes sense, and then eventually they'll get to this place that we mentioned earlier, where it's like, okay, either you've built a platform around IAC, or now it's kind of building itself in a very disorganized way, and then you end up with this IAC based pipelines. That's what I see a lot of times, right? Leverage existing, for example, CI/CD tooling to then basically chain together a bunch of different scripts. And this is both Terraform IAC scripts, is also, Helm charts and Kubernetes manifests, a bunch of different things, right? And the problem there is that you can't do that in theory. So you can't have a platform that's sort of like built that way. The problem, though, is you kind of go back to square one, where we were talking about developers being overwhelmed and cognitive overload and so on. You're not really, you have a platform that's not really solving any of those problems, because you're still going to have developers confused about, like, wait, what's this, like, instead of spaghetti code, you have spaghetti config code, basically, right? Of like this like very complicated relationships between all this IAC scripts and application configurations and so on. And so again, you're in a situation where developers are afraid of screwing things up, so they won't touch anything, and they end up waiting, right? And on the flip side of that, yes, you have ticket ops. You also have a huge lack of standardization, right? You have huge, Mads, you mentioned this, right? Like to me, like one of the key sort of value propositions that are driven by platform engineering are around really three main pillars. It's standardization, it's automation, and to an extent, it's visualization as well. Because Justin was working at Cortex before. The visualization, the portal layers is very important to give that visibility in the enterprise. But underneath, right, the back end of the platform that needs to be driving automation, standardization by design across all the different workflows, across all the different development teams, right? And so I think when you want to evolve in maturity, going from just like simple IC to IC chained together in a bunch of pipelines to like proper enterprise grade internal development platform, is about templating, right? It's about turning this thing into templates that then are self-serviceable while staying within very clear guardrails that the platform team designs for the developers to consume.
That's awesome. Good. That was a good way to put that. I'm going to move us along because you would be shocked if you knew how long we've been chatting. I know it feels like only a couple of minutes, but I do want to get to another point. And Mads, I'll let you take a stab at this one. A lot of organizations answered that developers in their organization feel like continued learning opportunities, right, are a huge thing, right? It seems like bigger organizations are better equipped to do this, but it's something that developers value, right? Continued learning. I mean, even the mentorship, Justin, that you were just talking about a few minutes ago, developers love to give back to the community and help each other succeed, right? We all know this. Everybody's shaking their heads. But when you think about offerings for continued learning, right? What kind of continued learning things have you seen that you've implemented or you recommend? Like, what have you been a part of? And how did that impact you and your role or the roles of developers at your company for personal development? Because it's so valued to them as part of the developer experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is an endemic part of the culture at Retool, and something that I've seen. Yeah. I like the opportunities for learning and giving back are kind of hand in hand in many ways, which is like, it is refreshing and lovely to see. Some specific examples that I've been a part of. This will not be comprehensive. I almost want to like put a footnote of like, there's like a million other ways to do this. But the ones that I've personally participated in are things like lunch and learns. They sound simple, but it can be culturally revolutionary if you have something like that. And, you know, at my organization and some other ones I've been in the past, like other non-engineers are often invited into the engineering sessions. And so even though that is like the goal is primarily for engineers to be learning in those type of brown bag sessions, it actually up levels the whole like organization. You start being, you get lots of thoughtful questions. And so it is both an opportunity for learning and an opportunity for learning a slightly different way or seeing things in a different perspective. I love that. We also specifically do something called build-alongs. So those are externally. We usually we release those into the wild. They are for people to build along with us in the platform. But there's a learning opportunity there, right? Is like you have to prepare and get the curriculum set for what you as the engineer or the technical PMM. My counterpart Keenan is like the build-along wizard. Like what he has to learn and gather and put together as an educator is a development opportunity for folks who come in and do that kind of thing. So I love those. I keep being mindful of how much I talk, but I would say those two specifically came to mind as those are, you know, internally driven, but invite so many people in with you. And I think that is something that should always be prioritized when you learn. Yeah.
So cool. So cool. Yeah. Real quick. We got one more question after this one, but Justin, why don't you throw something in there? And then Luca real quick. And then I've got one last question for each of y'all as we wrap up.
Yeah, I guess a couple of just quick points there. Like number 6 on the list of high value use cases in this research report from AI is learning new capabilities, learning new techniques. So, you know, I mean, I think a lot of us do that anyway. Like explain this like I'm a 5-year-old, and we know that technique. But I think that I was privileged to be chief architect for a company called OpenLogic, which is still doing great. They are now owned by Perforce. And the way that company worked was we were effectively providing community open source, support for community open source. So if an enterprise wants to, you know, use a community Apache web server and something breaks at 2:00 in the morning on New Year's Eve, like there's someone you could call. And the way that we were able to scale that business model and to be able to keep taking on more and more open source that we could support was turning every Friday into a learning day. And the nice thing, it's not always easy for organizations to do that, but we could tie this directly to contract revenue. We were like, okay, well, the more skills that we bring into the team, the more contracts we could ship. I think that you will find that actually works, even though this was such a direct relationship. A more educated workforce and a more elevated workforce will be a more productive workforce. There will be an economic payoff for this. So it shouldn't be something that's too hard to sell, even though it seems like we're stealing time. We're really not. Like we're optimizing kind of what can be done with that time. So I would say, yeah, I love the brown bag. I love the blending of non-technical and technical into the same learning, because we have another opportunity here too. In interviewing some of the folks for this research survey, I've found that some companies have now gotten to the point where they can take traditionally a non-building employee, so like a TPM or somebody like that, and put them on basic low-risk coding tasks using AI, things like API development, plugin development, and stuff like that. That is also another learning opportunity that's well supported by Mads's point about having some of these like more hybrid learning sessions. So I could go on and on too. This is something I'm passionate about as well. At the end, smart people like to learn, and so give them opportunities to learn. It'll build loyalty. It'll build better productivity.
I love that. And that wraps into our last question. Luke, I'll let you go first here. On developer advocacy programs, right? And there's advocacy internal and external. right? And the teams that I find do it well have developer advocacy programs that are for the people using their platform as well as the people building it, right? So whenever you talk about developer advocacy programs, it's numerous benefits to developers and many different kinds of organizations at all different levels. But sometimes they feel like there's too many resources that it's going to take to get this up and running, right? And so there's a hypothesis within DZone that if there's an increase in adoption rates of this stuff over time for developer advocacy, it would be more gradual. So as your place on this expert panel, what does developer advocacy mean for you? And how are some of the ways that you love to have your organization provide support for your engineering teams? And this will be the last question. So Luca, and go through and then I'll wrap us up.
Yeah. So the way, I was just giving a talk 2 days ago about like what are some of the current challenges that we see in large enterprises that are thinking about improving developer experience, that are thinking about, how do I do platform engineering? And the thing that they really struggle with is like, how do I, get everybody on board with this initiative? And then how do I get developer adoption across this, the platform and the different improvements that I drive? And so for me, developer advocacy really sits at the intersection of both of those things, right? I think the moment you start looking at your platform as an internal product, like you should, you start building in it, product marketing best practices, right? And so it's really about turning first is looking at developers as your customers, which is the first big kind of like logical jump that some people need to do. And then the second one is like, okay, well, I want to turn those customers into advocates, right? Which is really that's then ultimately what drives the virality of adoption of platforms and general initiatives within the engineering organization, right? And so that to me is an essential part of how we think about internal tooling and how we improve. It's not just about improving the tech, right? It's, people come with it. And so it's always taking this holistic approach to, okay, how do I improve the workflows? How do I build a better platform? But really, building the distribution in it. That's what the best products have. And ultimately that's what makes a difference, because otherwise you risk ending in a place where, you get a bit of adoption, then maybe your champion leaves, and then you get stuck in that middle plateau where the thing doesn't go on its own, doesn't grow on its own.
That's awesome. All right, Mads, what's your top thing? What's top of mind as we're wrapping up that you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. On the external side, like getting engineers embedded in the communities that they're actually their product or their feature or is out there, giving them the opportunity to be in that community is the external one. And on the internal side, celebrating things that aren't just shipping and celebrating parts of your engineering organization that are not, I worked 30 extra hours over the weekend and missed my kid's soccer game. That is a cultural thing that I will never shut up about. That is great. Be productive, but celebrate the wins that are also perpetuating a good culture. Set that standard.
Love it. All right, Justin, wrap us up.
I'm really glad that Luca hit on the concept of the product management or product marketing aspect of platform engineering. I mean, I'm here in LA right now to deliver a talk in a few hours called Platform Engineers Are Product Managers. And I think that is the big difference between like a DevOps pipeline or set of automations. And when we really have a proper platform that's being thought of, to Luca's point about developers being customers for that platform and releasing things iteratively and giving the same rigor that we would give to a product that we were releasing externally into our customers. I think that's really important. I've been a developer avocado for a long part of my career. I think that they're some of the most important and interesting members kind of the overall workforce. You can, of course, have external advocacy and internal advocacy. Both are very, very important. I think that one thing I've learned too about really studying and optimizing developer experience is that sometimes you really need someone else, someone who might be a little bit more say, aggressive or extroverted to advocate on behalf of developer experience internally. Because developers spend so much time in the weeds, they often don't have time to complain about what's going wrong, or they're so inured to the developer experience, a poor developer experience, that they don't even realize that there are things that could be improved. So I think that advocacy is so far-ranging, but I have a huge respect for the developer advocacy community at large. I think it's a very important role.
That is awesome. Well, listen, thank you all so much. Great panelists. Loved having you here. Such an important conversation surrounding our developers. Big thank you to everyone out there tuning in today for our chat. We hope that you got some really good insights into how to improve developer experience at your own place. And a special thanks to both Retool and DX for supporting this discussion. Your support has made our event a success. And if you enjoyed our discussion, you're out there and you want to see more just like it, head on over to dzone.com/events to see all of our on-demand content. Stay with us so you can tell us how we did. We'd love to hear your feedback because we're always looking to improve. We'll see you next time.